The 2024 Paris Olympics have brought us no shortage of conversation, very little of it having to do with the competition itself. However, the most infamous of these controversies surrounds the gender qualification of two athletes, Imane Khelif of Algeria and Yu-ting of Taiwan, competing in women's boxing. The discussion itself is perhaps much more complicated than you may have imagined. In any case, both athletes claimed the gold medal in their respective weight classes this past weekend. What are the odds? Live from the studio, I'm Jimmy Selesky.
Perfect.
All right, folks. Now, as I mentioned, this controversy actually involves two Olympic boxers, Imane Khelif in the 66 kilogram or 145 pound weight class, and Yu-ting in the 57 kilogram or 125 pound weight class. But we're going to be focused primarily today on Imane Khelif of Algeria because that seems to be what everyone else is focused on. It seems to be the much more popular, controversial debate. And I would assume that may have something to do with the idea that potentially, and I don't know this for sure, so don't quote me on it, but perhaps Yu-ting's case for competing in the women's bracket is much less valid. It is perhaps much more obvious that Yu-ting should not be boxing women. However, as it pertains to Imane Khelif, I can say personally that her case is at the very least extremely debatable. And that, of course, leads us to today's discussion. I first want to summarize to the best of my ability the timeline of events that led us to the 2024 Paris Olympics and the qualification of these two athletes. I then want to dispel of some of the myths and talk about what we do know, because unfortunately, it's not a lot. When you're dealing with someone's personal medical history, there is a certain level of confidentiality involved there, rightfully so. And when you're trying to have a public dialogue about someone's DNA, genealogy, or whatever, you're left with a lot of speculation and not a lot of hardline evidence. And lastly, I want to discuss the controversy itself, because this level of division and public backlash does not exist in a vacuum. While it may appear, after further inspection, that Imane Khelif's particular situation is not really political or ideological at all, this is one of those rare and unique instances where there is actually a very scientific and philosophical debate to be had. More often than not, this is not the case. As we have seen time and time again in recent history, more often than not, this type of thing is entirely politically and ideologically driven. And therefore, you are not insane for having assumed at first glance that this was no different. But for now, it is important to understand this situation. So going back to 2023, both athletes failed a gender qualification test for the World Championships administered by the IBA, the International Boxing Association. Both athletes appealed those results, and both of them subsequently withdrew their appeals. The Olympics Committee, however, the IOC, with their own standards and regulations, did not honor that disqualification, which allowed them to compete in the 2024 Paris Olympics. And that leads us to now. What is publicly known as a result of these IBA tests is not the chromosomal makeup of either of these two athletes. We do not publicly know if either of these individuals possesses a Y chromosome. What we do know is that these tests indicate both of these athletes are biological males. That is not determinative fact, that is presumption of the evidence we have available. It is important to note that both athletes identify as female. They do not identify as transgender females, and to the best of our knowledge, at least in the case of Imane Khelif, she has lived her entire life as a woman. There was a birth certificate released which showed her as female at birth. And there's also a lot of pictures online circulating showing her as a young girl. Now, this is much more speculative on my part. It's much more circumstantial evidence, but Imane Khelif comes from the country of Algeria. Algeria is very Muslim, very traditional. Trans really isn't a thing there. It's illegal to transition. And the idea that Khelif has decided to follow some woke agenda and exist as a high-profile transgender athlete in Algeria seems highly unlikely. Her situation is a little bit more involved than that. Now, short of pulling her pants down on live television, we'll likely never get to the bottom of exactly what genitalia Imane Khelif possesses. However, to the best of my knowledge, all the seemingly reliable information I've come across in my research insinuates that Khelif was born with a vagina and underdeveloped male genitalia. Imane Khelif, to the best of my estimation, is an intersex person. We used to call that a hermaphrodite back in the day. We call it intersex now, but regardless of the terminology, it is safe to say, from everything I can tell, that even if Khelif is a biological male, they are not fully male in the conventional sense. Her parents, given these circumstances, chose to raise her as a girl. And you can imagine that that's probably the right decision, right? I mean, I hate to sound crass when I say this, but if you actually try to put yourself in that position, do I raise my child as a man with a vagina and no dick? Or do I raise my child as a semi-masculine girl with a vagina who just can't get pregnant? I mean, come on. I can't think of anything worse than being a guy with no dick, and I mean that. I'm not even trying to be funny. That's gotta be horrible. Anytime you're in love with a girl, I mean, how do you even, that's horrible. It just is, okay? You raise her as a girl. Worst case scenario, if she's still straight, she's a straight guy, so she likes women. Okay, well, you're a lesbian now. You're a lesbian. And now it doesn't even matter if you can't get pregnant, because that's not a thing either. And you already box, so, I mean, it kind of fits the bill anyway. You're a lesbian boxer. Great. I think her parents made the perfect call. But that's not really the question here. Now, what I did find interesting in my extensive research of various clinical diagnoses speculated online, that the most likely is a disorder known as 5-ARD. And as you've probably guessed at this point, I am not a doctor. I live in a garage, and I'm about to smoke a cigarette. So if you'll allow me, I'm going to give you what I like to call a sigsplanation. All right. So, let's bring you a quick recap through biology. As we hopefully all know, every one of us, or at least most of us, are born with either two X chromosomes or an X and Y chromosome. That is what determines whether you are a female or a male. You receive an X chromosome from your mother in the egg, and you receive either an X or a Y chromosome from your father in his sperm. Gross. Now, what I find particularly amusing about this is that technically, all of us start out in the womb as females. It is the Y chromosome, if you possess it, that contains the gene which instructs your development into a male. Therefore, I have been known to say from time to time that all men are just chicks who literally grew a pair. That is technically true, I think. If you've ever observed yourself in the mirror, men, you'll notice that you do have nipples for some reason. They don't serve a purpose. And that space between your balls and your asshole, known as the taint or the gooch, is where your vagina should have been. So, every man listening to this right now, just know that you are one chromosome away from being a bitch. So listen up, pussy. 5-ARD is a disorder where the gene on the Y chromosome that instructs male development is suppressed. Therefore, although people with this condition do possess an XY chromosome pair, making them, in theory, a biological male, the gene expression that dictates their male development is hindered, oftentimes resulting in the continued development of a vagina and the underdevelopment of your male reproductive organs. you may have a vagina but no uterus and testicles that are inside your body still, which continue to produce testosterone, and therefore, when you do go through puberty, you actually do undergo a male puberty, meaning that instead of developing breasts and a menstrual cycle, you will develop into a man. You just don't have the parts. And if that is, in fact, the condition affecting Imane Khelif, then she is not unprecedented in competing with this condition. Caster Semenya of South Africa is another well-known Olympic athlete who actually won gold in the women's 800 meter in the 2016 Olympics. We're gonna get back into that a little later, but for now, that concludes your biological sixplanation. Now, moving back into the 2024 Olympics, her first match was against Italy's Angela Carini, who infamously, within the first minute of the bout, dropped to the canvas crying, proclaiming that this is unfair, forfeited the match, and this scene went viral. Naturally, this being Khelif's first appearance in the Olympics, her first real exposure, and the first time that the public at large saw her fight, and this was the outcome.
You will fail.
And after watching this video and considering everything we just discussed, you kind of have to feel bad for both of them. Obviously, you feel for Carini of Italy for being, in her opinion, screwed over. And it's kind of hard to debate that. Objectively speaking, Imane Khelif has a massive biological advantage in that fight. Carini was forced to contend with that in her opening match and be eliminated from the Olympics rather than having an opportunity to fight a biological female in the women's boxing bracket. That kind of sucks. Likewise, it's also sad to watch Imane Khelif follow her around the canvas attempting to console her while Carini wants absolutely no part of it, because we know now that she's not out to cheat. She's not trying to hurt anyone. She is a woman, to the best of our ability to classify it, but unfortunately, in the context of sports, and particularly in a fist fight, boxing, you don't have to know anything about her chromosomal makeup, her testosterone levels, her hormones, whatever. Her birth certificate, doesn't matter. You don't have to know any of that to look at her and understand that this is physiologically a man. And while I don't believe that that matters or should matter in virtually any other aspect of her life, unfortunately, it does matter here. Lin Yu-ting of Taiwan has had similar fortune in her bracket, and not without controversy. Two of her opponents felt strongly enough to give the X gesture at the camera after losing, insinuating, "You should have X chromosomes to be fighting me."
哇，不要再比这个了，这样子就太过分了。
The reason I speculated earlier that we're not talking about this one as much because it's probably much more obvious, I say that because it, to me, is much more obvious. She doesn't even really attempt to look like a woman. Not that you should have to, but just passing the eye test. The haircut, the body, everything, pretty obviously a dude. There seems to be a lot less wiggle room here. She's a more dominant boxer. She comes in as a number one seed. She's a world champion. You know, people make the argument that because Khelif has lost a handful of times throughout her career, that perhaps her biological advantage is overstated. I don't believe that applies as much to the Taiwanese boxer. I don't believe that she has been nearly as non-dominant as Khelif has. Not that Khelif hasn't been dominant, but I think even more so with Lin Yu-ting. That's probably why we're not talking about it. It really does beg the question, was this fair? And if so, what are the odds? Now, it's been a while since we talked about odds on this show. It's been a while since we've done the Rook Look. I want to talk about odds today because it's important to understand the statistical significance, the likelihood that the two female athletes in question at the Olympics over their gender identity also both happen to win the gold medal in their respective weight classes. If we're going to make the case that these women do not possess a massively unfair biological advantage over their competition, then it would probably help if they don't both go on to dominate their competition. And again, this is not an attack on either one of these two individuals. This is really just a conversation about reality. For the sake of example, let's pretend that the outcome of these Olympic boxing brackets is completely random. Now, obviously, it's not. First of all, the sheer fact that you have arrived to the Olympics is clearly not random. Every single person in the Olympics was the best their country had to offer. Likewise, the outcome of the Olympics is also not random. Whoever performs the best wins. But if we're going to make the argument that this biological anomaly, this characteristic plays no real role in the outcomes of the tournament, then it's important to determine the likelihood, the odds that the two winners of these respective brackets should also just so happen to randomly possess this characteristic. What are the odds of that? Let's start with Imane Khelif. The 66 kilogram women's bracket contains 20 fighters, including Khelif, from 20 different countries across the world. The odds of Khelif being the best of these fighters randomly are 1 in 20, or 5%. Assuming that all of them have the same chance of winning, this is akin to writing down each of their names on a piece of paper, throwing them into a hat, and pulling one out. Lin Yu-ting's bracket at 57 kilograms has 22 fighters. The odds of Lin Yu-ting randomly being the best fighter in that bracket are 1 in 22, or about 4.5%. The odds of both of them happening to both be the best fighter in their respective brackets are 1 in 20 times 1 in 22, which is 1 in 440. That's about 0.2%. To put it in gambling terms, the break-even payout of selecting an outcome with a 1 in 440 chance of happening is plus 43,900. Let's call it plus 44,000. This is a plus 44,000 bet if you were to randomly select these two particular athletes to win their respective brackets. That's a lot. Bet $1, win $440. That's how unlikely this is. The Rook Look. And perhaps that segment was a little tedious, just given the fact that very few people, I would hope, would go so far as to suggest that their characteristics pose no advantage whatsoever, that this is literally completely random. It really comes down to how much of an advantage is it, and at what point does it become disqualifying? We've heard the Michael Phelps argument, who actually went to my high school, Towson High School, Baltimore guy. He produces 50% less lactic acid than the average human being. He has this insane wingspan to height ratio that basically makes him this like superhuman ideal swimmer. These are all clear biological advantages that Michael Phelps possessed, and that is very likely a major defining component of why he was so dominant. But no one is suggesting that Michael Phelps should be disqualified for possessing these biological advantages. You can't disqualify someone necessarily for being a freak athlete. However, this situation seems to be a little different. And in order to understand why that is, you kind of have to delve into why we segregate men's and women's sports in the first place. Clearly, we don't segregate men and women's sports based off of gender identity. The idea that a man should be allowed to compete in women's sports simply because they identify as a female subjectively, that is stupid. People will argue that. People have been arguing that. On mainstream levels, people argue this. But most logical people understand that that is really dumb. We segregate men's and women's sports because of the physical reality and differences between men and women. The physical advantages that men have over women that are not unique. This is not certain men possess these freak biological advantages over certain women. This is, on average, by definition, men in general possess massive physical advantages over women when it comes to sports. In musculature, in body chemistry, in bone density, and virtually every other category you can imagine, maybe except for pain tolerance. So now we're kind of at this weird catch-22, because we've already acknowledged with the Michael Phelps argument that simply being a freak athlete, simply possessing a biological advantage over the competition is not disqualifying. But also, we all agree, hopefully, that the segregation of men's and women's sports due to the natural biological advantages is necessary. So at what point does a biological advantage in female sports necessitate disqualification? But as long as we continue to remember the point in the first place, the point of segregating men's and women's sports is ultimately to protect women, not the other way around. That's the purpose, to make competition fair, safe, and viable for women. We don't keep Caitlin Clark out of the NBA to make it more fair for LeBron James. We keep LeBron James out of the WNBA to make it more fair for Caitlin Clark and the female players. That's why we do it. The purpose of all of this is to make it fair for women. So, not saying that I have the answer, but if I had to come up with a solution, I would say that women's sports should be for biological women and no one else. If you are a biological woman, a female, point blank, no doubt about it, XX chromosome, everything's up to snuff, you compete in women's sports. And that's it. That's it. Everyone else, biological men, trans women, intersex, everyone else, I guess men's sports. I mean, unless an intersex/trans league, I don't know if there's enough trans and intersex athletes to justify its own separate division. I don't know if that's on the table, but assuming it's not, and we're just left with men and women's sports, then I would have to say women compete in women's sports, everyone else competes in men's sports, if the goal is to protect women. And that may seem unfair. It may seem cold. And the reality is, it kind of is. The reality is, no matter how you slice this situation, it's unfair for someone. So it really comes down to finding a solution that's unfair for the least amount of people. If you allow athletes who identify as female, even if they socialize as females, even if they were raised as females, but they have biological, physiological, male development and characteristics, that is unfair for every other woman in women's sports who is forced to compete against them. That is unfair for everyone except for them. And they are a very small minority. If, however, those individuals compete in the men's league, you could make an argument that perhaps it is unfair for them, but it is most fair for everyone else. So is the solution to make something that gives an advantage to a few people and is unfair to most people? Or do you come up with a solution that is most fair for most people and provides a slight disadvantage to a few people? I mean, this is just the nature of reality. I don't know what else to tell you. I'm not the person making these rules, but if you had to ask me, that would be my solution. Whatever you come up with, let me know. The point is that's me trying to come up with a reasonable solution, whether you agree with it or not. It's at least reasonable, I would say. Moving into the final portion of this discussion, as I said, I'd like to discuss the divisiveness and backlash itself surrounding this issue. And the fact that, while perhaps you may have learned a lot on this show, or perhaps I haven't said anything you didn't already know, I can, for one, say that I was not completely aware of the entirety of the situation, and I did admittedly assume that this, much like virtually every other time this type of ordeal crosses my desk, was bullshit. It was completely made up. It was completely phony. It was completely woke and ideological. And the reality is that wasn't the case for this particular situation. I'm still ultimately drawn toward the same conclusion, as you can see, but I'm coming at it from a different perspective, a different angle. And I don't feel bad or guilty about the fact that that wasn't my initial perception. In fact, I feel quite good about the fact that I took the time to look into it and realized that in this particular instance, my initial assumptions were not fully correct. But when you look around and you see, I guess, conservatives or whatever, all in a tiff about this situation, assuming that it is what we're used to, which is bullshit, who is to blame for that? Really, who is to blame for that? Now, I know the easy answer is you're to blame for not being fully informed on this. Okay, fine. But, the average human being doesn't have the time to become an expert on every single individual incident that ever occurs in the universe. The average human being works off of a thing called pattern recognition. And pattern recognition is what happens when you see a situation play itself out time and time and time again, and in a time-saving, processing-saving mode that your brain undergoes smartly, you see things through the lens of the patterns you've observed. The fact that people assumed that this Imane Khelif situation was yet another example of woke bullshit, trans agenda affecting women's sports is not unbelievable. It's not unforeseeable. It's not out of the blue. Again, it's not in a vacuum. The majority of the situations like this that we have seen have literally been that. Not this weird debate question over, is it a man? No, just this is a man. They have decided to transition into a woman, and they are now competing against women, and more often than not, dominating. There's no gray area in that, usually. It's that cut and dry, and the same people who are now online in regards to this Imane Khelif situation being like, she doesn't even have an XY chromosome, she's this. All of a sudden that matters to them. When usually even that doesn't matter. It's convenient, now that there is an actual argument to be had, that they are actually going to make a real argument about biology and why it matters. But usually that doesn't matter. Usually it doesn't matter what chromosomes you have. It just matters what you identify as. Suddenly, it matters. Suddenly, you're stupid she has this chromosome or this disorder, and that's why she should be allowed. Well, you were going to say she was allowed regardless. If it came out tomorrow that Imane Khelif has an XY chromosome, she has a full-grown dick, she is a full-blown transgender man competing in women's boxing, a large percentage of the people arguing on her behalf would continue to argue on her behalf. It's just a matter of coincidence, really, that this particular situation happens to kind of make sense a little bit. Countless examples, famous examples, like mainstream examples, not like some weird underground shit. No, like Leah Thomas competes in Division I college swimming for the University of Pennsylvania. Leah Thomas first went to University of Pennsylvania as a man named William Thomas, competed his entire freshman year on the swim team, was ranked 65th in the men's 500-yard freestyle, transitioned to Leah Thomas after her freshman year, and proceeded to win the women's 500-yard freestyle swimming championship. And everyone came to her defense. The woman, the actual woman who placed second in that event, who should be able to say that she was a college national champion swimmer, was forced to accept silver because she lost to a man. And an alarming amount of people, a lot of people, saw nothing wrong with that. A lot of people called you sexist, called you a bigot for thinking there was anything wrong with some chick who was just a dude 2 years ago coming in and dominating the competition, taking away medals from deserving female athletes. That was perfectly fine. And there was no debate about intersex or, the 5-ARD condition. No, this was just a dude that was a dude and grew his hair out and swam for the women's team. No problem. I see no problem here. There was a video, a whole thing about a high school volleyball player, trans athlete, who spikes a ball during a game. The ball is tracked at 70 miles per hour, hits a girl on the opposing team in the head and knocks her out. Sent her to the hospital. A lot of people thought that was insane. A lot of people didn't. A lot of people continue to defend the right of this trans volleyball player and others of the like to continue to compete as women in women's sports. We've had full-blown trans women in the Olympics. Laurel Hubbard competed in the Tokyo Olympics, weightlifting, as a trans woman, a full-blown man who transitioned into a woman. So if you thought that this boxing situation was ridiculous, it wasn't because you crossed some crazy boundary of ridiculousness and assumed it was way more ridiculous than anything you've ever seen. It was because you merely assumed that it was as ridiculous as everything you've ever seen over the past few years. And when it turned out that this very unique situation wasn't quite as ridiculous as everything else, oh my God, what are you, nuts? This one situation isn't as bad as you think. Really. You have to feel bad for Imane Khelif, who does see herself as a woman, not as a trans woman, a woman. She wants to be seen as a woman. She wants to compete as a woman. And you kind of want her to be able to do that. It's just a shame that we also have to acknowledge reality when it comes to combat sports. But she is seeing all these things online, questioning her gender, calling her a man, when she never saw herself as that. People are outraged. People are saying all this shit. And it's easy to want to blame those people. But I saw a comment on an Instagram or Facebook post a couple days ago. And it said, none of this was ever an issue before woke took over. And I thought, yeah, it really wasn't. And that's kind of what this comes down to. Real, unique situations that require attention and empathy are completely drowned out and completely trivialized by all the non-important bullshit. In the same way the Me Too movement lost steam years back, because all of a sudden you had a bunch of women come out and start telling stories about like weird dates they had, or, oh my God, he told me he would give me this role in a movie if I sucked his dick, and I did. And don't put that in the same conversation, because when you do, it undermines the people that actually were victims of real rape. And now when those people come out to tell their stories, and it falls on the ears of people that have done nothing but hear bullshit stories like yours for the past 10 years, it makes it harder for people to believe them. It makes it harder for them to exist as legitimate rape victims. You've made it worse. There's legitimate racism in the world. But when every single police encounter that involves a white cop and a black suspect, and something goes wrong and it's automatically tossed up as racial injustice, it checks all the boxes. White cop, black suspect, something went wrong, racism. And then when you watch the video, the guy has a gun, he takes a shot at police, he doesn't comply, he's overdosing on fentanyl like George Floyd, all that shit. And you go, I don't think that was racism. I think that was just at work. Maybe even the cop was being a dick. But cops can sometimes be dicks. It's not automatic that a cop was being a dick because you were black. I've had plenty of cops be dicks to me. But when every single one of those encounters is pushed by the media to be this awful display of racism and this horrible systemic problem that we have in this horrible country, then when an actual instance of real racism occurs, people are numb to it. They're deaf to it. Oh, here we go, another, okay. But what if that was actually real this time? Well, now people aren't hearing it. You've drowned it out. Again, you've made it worse. You've trivialized the victims in reality. In the case of men's and women's sports, when 99% of what is talked about is transgender athletes, biological men who existed as biological men their entire lives, who underwent biological male puberty, decide on a whim that they want to transfer and become a woman. And by that, it means maybe grow their hair out, but maybe not even that. They just are a woman all of a sudden. They change their name to like something else. And then all of a sudden, they should be allowed to compete in women's sports. When that's the majority of what you've seen for the past 5 to 10 years, you've trivialized people like Imane Khelif who have a legitimate case to be made. And is that my fault? Is that the people who have noticed the pattern's fault? Or is it your fault for creating the pattern, creating a reality where Imane Khelif's rare and unique, complex situation is lumped into all the non-unique, non-rare, non-legitimate situations, and hers becomes just as silly, just as trivialized? And with all the gaslighting on a daily basis in just the Olympics alone. Oh, that wasn't the Last Supper. That was the dinner of Dionysus, the wine guy. It was the Last Supper. Everyone knows it was the Last Supper. If you're going to do something, just do it and say you did it. Don't do something provocative and then tell people it's not that. I don't even give a shit about that. I give a shit about the fact that you won't own it. If you're going to make a statement, make a fucking statement. It's what I talked about the other day with the whole Republicans are weird thing. And then I have people in the comments going, ooh, somebody's triggered. Sending positive vibes your way. Maybe you can work that out, buddy. Oh, you don't like that we're calling you weird? It's not a big deal. What's the big deal? Why are you taking it so seriously? I'm not. I'm just calling it out that you're doing it. You obviously made an effort to come up with this whole political campaign to call Republicans weird. And then when we notice it, you go, I didn't do that. It's like getting in an argument with your girlfriend. Are you mad? I'm not mad. I'm fine. You seem mad. Can you just tell me what's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Jesus, what's wrong with you? I'm literally just sitting here. I'm not even mad. Pretty sure you're mad. I'm pretty sure you're trying to piss people off. That's such a bitch move. If you're trying to piss me off, look at me in the face and tell me you're trying to piss me off. If this pisses you off right now, rest assured, I mean it. If the radical, progressive, woke agenda were ever honest about anything they are doing and saying, then there would be no reason to doubt that they were being honest and reasonable about this. What are the odds that you've heard the story of the boy who cried wolf? Probably very high. The story of someone who lied so much and so often that when he finally did tell the truth that one time, no one listened. And a lot of people were hurt because of it. What are the odds that you're self-aware enough to recognize that's you right now? Probably pretty small. And that's why I wouldn't bet on it. Till next time, I'm Jimmy Selesky. This is Live from the Studio. Peace.